real shit anymore.
You have to have these difficult conversations.
So the movement is about equality.
That was a really intense debate.
Let's just keep it strictly about facts and we'll be good.
I mean, this is a verbal fight. Mm-hmm. I mean,
it is.
We invite you to be a part of the league and participate in actually debating.
Can you hear me now?
Good evening, Great Debate League. I am your moderator and host for this evening, Ebony Johnson. We appreciate you for taking part in tonight's debate. I hope that you can stay with us until the very end as we rely on your votes to determine who is the greater debater. Tonight's debate is brought to you by Natasha Ria Art Gallery. The Natasha Ria Art Gallery provides a space for the artistic community to connect, meet those of like or different minds, and to engage in the full artistic experience. The gallery focuses on the exhibition of underrepresented artists and their authentic voices. It is also available for rental for book signings, intimate concerts, paint parties, artist talks, and other events. You can follow Natasha Ria Art Gallery on social media. Tonight's premise: critical race theory is helpful to Americans in general. Debating the affirmative position, Theo Wilson. From Denver, Colorado, Theo E.J. Wilson is a graduate of Florida A&M University, a community activist who survived police brutality. He's an advocate for justice in the movement for Black lives. Theo is a National Poetry Slam champion, author, and collegiate speaker. He is the executive director of Shop Talk Live, Inc. Debating the negative position, Justin Wilson. Justin was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, has a Bachelor's of Arts degree in theology from Southern Adventist University. At age 13, Justin spent a year in Costa Rica and discovered racism from the people there. He was always told that only white people were racist, but found that that was not true. Tonight's guiding definitions: critical race theory, a body of work that first emerged in American legal scholarship that argues that racism is ordinary, normal, and integral to social practices and institutions in the United States. Helpful, giving or ready to give help, useful. American, a native or citizen of the United States. This is an unranked debate. There will be no personal attacks of any kind, no profanity, and no interrupting. Both participants are allowed to call a fact-check timeout only during one of their designated speaking times. We will now begin with round one, opening statements. Each participant will provide an uninterrupted opening statement. We will begin with Theo Wilson, arguing the affirmative. Theo, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. So when we talk about critical race theory, the reason we're talking about this is because we have been unjustly baited into a cultural war. And this cultural war began with a gentleman by the name of Christopher Rufo. This was the summer of 2020, and on September 2nd, he gets pulled into Tucker Carlson's show after getting an email from his friend that says he felt offended and felt that it was unnecessary for him to learn about white privilege and microaggressions. And so when Christopher Rufo gets on Tucker Carlson's show, he mislabels diversity, equity, and inclusion critical race theory. And he has then, since that time, literally been spinning a cultural war so that we don't have to talk about inclusion. It has gone to the very top of the government. And of course, it got buried because of the election, and it got buried because of January 6th. But now it comes back into full effect right now because we're having to have these hard conversations about race. And as many of you know, there are outlets that race bait white people. Race bait white people because of their fragility in dealing with these subjects. Fox News has made a killing at this. We know this for a fact. And in case anybody has any doubts on whether or not Christopher Rufo was actually trying to start an unnecessary culture war, we have his confession in a tweet on March 15, 2021. Christopher Rufo writes, "The goal is to have the public read something crazy in a newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex an entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular in America. And he's been successful at that. What I feel is very necessary for us to talk about right now is the real critical race theory is not what we all been fighting about, been hearing about, but it does examine a very powerful thing, the intersection of law and race. These things are as old as 1638, the first time that we have this codified into law in the colonies before America is even America. We have this again with the Naturalization Act of 1790, and we have it all the way up until we have these prison industrial laws that have unjustly incarcerated Black folks. We know this because the thing that we're afraid to talk about in this country is systemic racism. Systemic racism doesn't show its face on the front end. You don't see a racial slur, a swastika, a Nazi sign, nothing like that. You don't hear the N-word. What you hear is the data on the back end that says that the application of the law has been unjust. And until we're ready to examine the intersection of race and law, we're not ready to dismantle dismantle systemic racism. And that's what the debate is really about. Although Christopher Rufo misapplied the term back in September 2020. That's my time.
Theo, and now for Justin Wilson, arguing the negative. You have 3 minutes.
But it's very simple, and I'm coming from the negative side, which is that critical race theory is not helpful, and simply is because it's just another way to be racist in an intellectual way, and you don't have to really go far to actually find out. You just look at their 5 or 6 basic tenets, which is permanence of racism, which it means that racism is permanent in our system, in the collective among whites versus BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, and people of color, so on. And the assumption is that whether the person means to be racist or not, he is in some way fulfilling a racist role through the system or by the system or just in the way he acts. So if a person comes into a store and he wants to be served and he happens to be Black, the assumption is whatever the outcome is, that person has done something racist towards that Black person. There is no way to actually explain the outcome of it. So if you look at data, any data that shows disparity between the races that's not favorable, that you always have to assume that there's racism behind it, whether the white person means to do something or not. Then the other idea, the other tenet is convergence of interest, which is basically white people, or I guess the white collective, they only allow certain things to happen when it's, to the benefit of Black people, if it's to their own benefit, if they have an interest too. So them actually giving freedom or allowing civil rights to progress and so on, that is actually a selfish thing for the white community because they end up benefiting from it. So even the idea such as affirmative action, because it seems to benefit white women, that is a selfish act, and therefore you can't give white people a credit for actually, I guess pushing for that or even allowing that in some way. Then the other tenet, which is counter narrative or storytelling, they believe that storytelling is actually better than objective truth and data. So this idea of your experience, your truth, is better than than data. That is actually paramount within the idea of critical race theory. So I could go on and on, and then also the idea of color blindness. That's a problem with critical race theory. You cannot be neutral or colorblind, which puts people in a damn if you do and damn if you don't scenario. So that is not helpful for America or anybody in the United States. I rest my case as of now, until we go back and forth.
All right, thank you both gentlemen for the first opening round. We will now begin round 2. This is the lightning round, which allows for an open cross-examination between both participants to engage in interrogation of their opponent's position. This is a shared time frame for both debaters. Audience, please listen carefully and pose your questions for our debaters. as audience Q&A is the next round. This round is 15 minutes. Debaters, you may begin.
Can I ask the question, do you believe that racism is permanent in the American system?
It doesn't have to be, but as of now, it has been. Yes.
Okay.
And there's like law after law that proves that. Would you like to hear about some of them?
Oh, well, not as of yet, but I have a follow-up question. So in every interaction that you've been through, you have had with a white person, do you assume that there's some racial element to it?
No, not at all. In fact, what you're talking about is interpersonal racism, which is different than institutional racism. Interpersonal racism is personal feelings of bigotry that have to do with whatever bias that you have about somebody. That ain't what I'm talking about. And that's not what critical race theory is talking about. It's talking about the intersection of race and law. Specifically, that's what it talks about. And what we say here is that we're talking about everything from the application of law to the interpretation of law that actually does come into play. And we see evidence of this all over the world, outcome after outcome. This is what we're dealing with. And that's what we're trying to dismantle. So changing the hearts and minds of white people, that's not what we're doing here. What we're trying to say is, America, you have a promise. And if you help us dismantle this thing that has been in the way of this promise, we could really be America for real. That's what we're trying to fight for.
Well, because what I hear is when you judge someone's, I guess, reaction to something, to this idea, you end up bringing up white fragility, which is not just a system. It's not the law. You're talking about somebody's heart. So is that not a racial issue that you're talking about right there when it comes to interpersonal, I guess, relations? You're thinking about what they're feeling, right?
It's a cultural issue. And so Dr. Joy DeGruy-Leary talks about this. The mechanism of environmental learning is how we learn culture, right? You learn to bake a lemon meringue pie from how your mama makes a lemon meringue pie. Well, you learn culture from that way as well. So the things that white people don't talk about, the things that they inherited, the traumas, and what we're dealing with is a traumatized culture from white folks. They hurt from winning, quote, the war of conquest. And that comes out in a cultural response that is known as white fragility. And if it's not checked, then when these white people become purveyors of certain systems, or the lever pullers in certain systems, it doesn't matter where they are, then they end up unconsciously often making the system affirm their bias. And so that's what we're trying to unpack. But it's cultural, not racial. It has nothing to do with white DNA, European features, or anything. This is a cultural issue that we're talking about here.
Okay, so then, all right, so let's say a white person says, hey, I am colorblind. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing to you?
I think that if you read their heart, most of the time they mean well. When a white person says I'm colorblind, what they're trying to say is that I've tried to do the work internally so that I don't pay forward the crime of racism because I know that's bad. So you're not dealing with somebody here who's going to say that all white people are intentionally racist. I'll never play that game. So what I'm saying to you is that when they say I'm colorblind, they say I want to actually learn you as a person and not by the color of your skin. So I actually don't fall into that category.
Okay, but is colorblindness the concept? Is that a good thing?
It depends on the scenario. In an interpersonal situation, colorblindness is good. In an institutional situation, colorblindness is bad. And the reason why colorblindness is bad is because you got to see the color in order to reverse the damage done. You see what I'm saying?
Okay. So let's say a police officer, he pulls you over. Do you want him to be colorblind, or do you want him to actually see the world through the lens of race?
I want him to actually see the fact that I'm black, and in a way that says this person right here, I have to police this person with the cultural awareness of where this person's culture is coming from. So let's say, for example, a police officer pulls me over. He has to understand that he's dealing with somebody who is going to contextualize him through my history. My history is of the police officer being somebody who is actually part of the lineage of slave catching, right? So I actually need him to see that. I need him to see that I'm going to have a different reaction in him than perhaps he would be if he's a white cop in my scenario, if the roles were reversed. You see what I'm saying? I actually need that cop to see my cultural context and police that well. And we got trainings right now run by people who are activists here that are getting that done in real time in Colorado.
So it just sounds like racial profiling. You just hope they just profile you in the positive way and be more sympathetic towards you. So, like, are you saying that they should not feel that way or have the same sympathy for white people?
I think that they need to understand the context of the community that they're policing. And so when you say racial profiling, that's a loaded word, because racial profiling, no, we've been fighting so hard to get rid of that. But the fact is, at some point in time, as a black man, I'm going to get pulled over. If this cop is actually aware of the cultural context and I'm interacting with him in, that is a good thing. So you can't unsee something after seeing it made it a problem. And I'll do Malcolm X's metaphor like this, right? If you jam a knife into my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, that's not healing. If you take it out all the way, that's not healing. Healing can only be done once the knife is out and the surgery begins. But the fact is that people did a very color-specific harm to black people and want to be colorblind to reverse it. That don't work.
Well, okay. So what it seems like is that when it comes to, I guess, pulling people over, when we want the law to actually see race, we're asking them to actually racially profile, just be nicer to black people because of the struggles that they went through, or the struggles that they put black people through. And you can't really, it's like you really can't measure that, because not everyone is going to feel like justice is actually being, put onto them. So how could you really, how could you measure that how could you measure that the government actually cares for me as they should?
Okay, so one of the things that you do is culturally literate policing. And one of the ways that they're trying to do that is hiring police from the neighborhoods that they come from. So my man, Ronald Hackett, is a police officer who polices the neighborhood he came from. Now, he and I was boys back in the day, but he's a cop now, right? My man, Chris Matlock, is a police officer who polices the neighborhood he came from. My cousin, Mark Johnson II, is a police officer who polices the community like the one he came from. So so they're already on top of this. They understand that the question that you're asking, they've been trying to work on this and solve it in certain areas. But in order to do that, you must see the injustice in order to target the injustice and fix it with certain tools that work for the community that you're serving and being paid by tax dollars to serve, by the way.
So, but see, this is the thing, though. Like, you're looking at a person's skin color. Yeah. You're assuming all these different things about their life. You're assuming that injustice has been done to them because you never met them. You don't have their history book in front of you. So you're pretty much judging a book by its cover, and then you want the cop to actually pretty much enact social justice on each individual.
That would be nice.
When really not every individual experienced all the injustice that you're talking about.
Yeah. So here's how you balance that, right? When I say, again, culturally literate policing, what we're talking about here is basically putting into context the experiences of the culture that you're serving, sir. And in order to do that, you have to actually take certain measures in your hiring practices, in your psychological profiling. See, I work with the police in terms of my activism, so I actually know this stuff from the inside out. And so what they're trying to do right here in Denver is specifically and this got a little pushback when it first came down the pipe. But my man Il7, he's a rapper, but he's an activist, and he's putting together cops and the kids and neighborhoods in these little basketball games. Now, people's like, that's a cheap photo op for the cops, right? But what we do see is systemically on the back end, when we know that there's a relationship between the cops and the community, then we see less unlawful use of force. We see less arrests, these mass arrests that happen in the community. We see less of that going on. This is all about relationship building, and you need to do that in a culturally literal context. So that example isn't really like a gotcha. This is actually something that the police are way ahead of you on.
Okay, I wouldn't say such a thing, because it just sounds like nice racism. In other words, you're looking at a person and said, you know what? I see this person's skin color. I'm going to treat them differently than another race. I'm going to be nicer to this one because they've been treated very roughly. So let me be nice, or let me be positive towards that person. The other race, that other person, that other child right there, I could afford to ignore them right now because they already have the privilege of living a good life, even though I don't know them for sure. But these people, I know for certain that they have been through so much. This person.
So when you see a person, you see everything about them that's at least physical on the surface, which means that you're going to see the race. Like, colorblindness doesn't make sense. And so therefore, when we talk about, at least on the institutional level, because police are a part of an institution, see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. The police are a part of an institution, aren't they? Right?
Yes.
And so when we're dealing with how the police interact with a community, we have to take into account the fact that there's trauma on both sides, right? So now so let's flip this, right? Let's look at this through the lens of the police officer. This is very important. So a lot of people don't know that the average police officer is 3 times more in danger from the gun on his hip than any gun that he'll face in the street. Police officers commit suicide at 3 times the rate that they're killed in the line of duty, right? Part of the psychological profiling of the police officers that we're working with here in Denver is to make sure that when you do this diversity, equity, inclusion, bias training, you tease that out of them and make them confront it and make the culture of the police department confront it before they hit the streets. Why? Because cops are realizing that if you don't do that, it is a liability. If you don't teach a cop to actually be culturally literate, then what happens is the higher ups don't start trying to hire culturally literate police officers, and they end up committing an act that breaks the bonds with the community. Whether it is an unjust killing, whether it's excessive use of force, it gets caught on camera, and what happens? Now they got to work on the back end to heal what they could have healed on the front end, and that's what they're actually actively doing right now in Aurora PD, because they have a real bad reputation, but Denver PD is far ahead of them. This is the work that's being done.
Okay. So when it comes to, I would say convergence theory, or it's convergence interest, which is basically the idea that white people, they allowed, I guess, the progress of civil rights because it benefited them. So in other words, they gave freedom to the slaves, for example, because it will fill their pockets. You know, they give more jobs to blacks because it will fill their pockets. So their interests, they're aligned with black people. So therefore, they gave in to whatever black people wanted, or just BIPOC wanted. Isn't that a scenario where they damned if they do and they damned if they don't? In other words, they can't help the situation. They can't help but be selfish. Are you not assuming that they're all, let me not say all, but blindly, the masses of them are selfish by nature of being white?
Okay, so in a capitalist society, the bottom line is always at play, first and foremost. When Dr. Martin Luther King did the Poor People's March, he specifically said it didn't cost them a single dime to take down a whites only sign, right? Because they actually got money, and he acknowledged this before he died. They actually received money from integration, right? We know that for a fact. When it comes to the emancipation of slavery, there was an entire war that was fought, right? Where black men actually helped win that war, but they let go of it by the blood, like it was from their cold dead hands. Every inch of progress that black people have gotten, white people didn't give it. We had to press to get it. And I think that that's a very important thing, because even abolition was fueled by slave revolt. Every single time that you had a boost in abolitionist sentiment is because a black person cut off the head of the slave master, and they were like, I'd probably do that too if I was in their shoes. So what we're saying is that convergent interest is always there. There's never been a time, and I've got to put this caveat in there, where all white people have been racist. Never. That's never been the case. All white people have never had to be racist for racism to affect all black people. Now that is where the things get tricky, because we know that there were people fighting for our freedom way back in the day, right? The problem is that when it actually got traction, it needed to be most of the time by some kind of force, embarrassment, or some kind of popular uprising that made them actually change their ways and be true to the Constitution. We know this. They never would have given an inch if black people wouldn't have pushed. And you have to be honest about that, brother. Yeah, okay, sure. So, but my question is, could they actually do something? Could they do something without being selfish? Of course. On individual basis, listen. See, this is the benefit of growing up in Colorado, because I got white friends of every, disposition. I got conservative white friends. I got liberal white friends, right? And we're friends on a real level. Does that make sense? We're friends on a real level. The societal conditions that allow us to be in public together, the societal conditions that, let's say if I fell for a white woman wanted to marry her, that would be somewhat feasible, were made because black folks actually had to make that push to really happen in real life. Now, the things that are sustained have benefited them. In fact, Dr. Amos Wilson theorized that integration would only work in an expanding economy. Black folks have the experience, last one hired, first one fired. So in times like we're living in now with economic contraction, sadly, it actually does, the self-interest of white folks show up when it comes to who gets fired. And we see that the Department of Labor and Statistics has all of that information. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, what I would say that in closing, at least at this round, it doesn't seem like there's ever going to be an end towards this. Like white people will always be the supreme oppressor over blacks or over people of color. Now, I wanted to get into that a little bit more, but I would have just asked you, like, would there ever be a day in which there is no white supremacy?
It said time, and I don't want to violate.
Okay. I'm sorry about that.
I appreciate that, gentlemen, and appreciate you
Loaded
both for
question.
engaging lightning round. We will now begin round 3, the audience question and answer round. We invite our audience to submit questions for the debaters. Each participant will be given the chance to respond to each question uninterrupted. Please submit your questions now. As we bring up our audience questions, we'd like to thank our sponsor, Natasha Rhea Art Gallery. Coming soon is an artist talk featuring Warren Stiles Harvey and Linnell Diggs. You can follow Natasha Rhea Art Gallery on social media for further information. Please support our growth by donating to our Cash App, $The Great Debate League. You can check us out on our YouTube page, The Great Debate League, Inc., and become a member of our Patreon page. We are also on Instagram and Twitter, and you can subscribe to our podcast on Spotify and iHeartRadio. And now we will take our first audience question. And as we bring that up, Theo, you will be the first person to respond as our affirmative debater. This question is, what is your position on critical race theory being taught in public schools? You have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Yeah, so that's a straw man. Critical race theory is not now nor has ever been taught in our schools, at least publicly. It's always been a graduate level course, right? And so what people were outraged about in all these school board meetings that are happening is that literally history that decenters whiteness is talking about being taught in our public schools, right? So you have the traditional school books that we've been having, and then you got new textbooks like Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States, which decenters the white narrative, and that threatens folks because it creates the feelings of guilt, and we're asked to care about the feelings of white folks. But these decentralized historical narratives that take whiteness out of the central focus should be taught in our public schools, because if they're not taught, then just by default, white habitual cultural norms will take over, and a new generation will be on the wrong side of history yet again if they don't unpack what's driving them unconsciously. You're on mute, sister.
Thank you for that, Theo. We will now ask you the same question, Justin. What is your position on critical race theory being taught in public schools? You have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Well, it definitely should not be taught, considering that kids are innocent. They're born, or they could be raised without the idea of seeing each other as different racially speaking, or having to treat each other differently based on their race. Now, once you teach that, you either have to live by the rules of CRT, which is, I guess, like disregard neutrality, disregard colorblindness, and treat one child, a black child, more special or unique than a white child, and say that this person actually went through more trauma. So I need to sympathize with this person, this kid, and this white kid. Well, he already had privilege. I mean, that's just basic truth. White kids have privilege, so therefore I could afford to ignore him or just give him less sympathies. Once you create that kind of culture, all you're doing is creating division, and it creates more of an explosive environment for race war.
Justin, thank you, Justin. We're going now to our second question from our audience. And as we are pulling that up, okay, do we recognize mass incarceration as a practice of racial discrimination? Justin, I will ask you this question first, and you have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
No, and that's the thing. When it comes to the idea of permanence of racism, which assumes that every single outcome, such as this data that Black people would, that there's pretty much just mass incarceration of Black people, you have to assume that it's always a racial thing or it's because of racism. And that's not necessarily the case. A lot of times it's because of cultural choices that we make as a collective. So we have to consider that. And, we can recognize that there may be some racism, but as far as the system itself, it's not racist. And if it is racist, we definitely have to examine what laws exactly is racist, not the outcome we consider as racist, but the very laws. And I found that there's no laws as racist. It's basically the choices, the cultural choices that is putting people in these disparities. So as far as races go.
Thank you. Theo, the same question for you. Do we recognize mass incarceration as a practice of racial discrimination? You have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Thank you. So I love what this book has to say about it. Can y'all see this? This is Dog Whistle Politics by Ian Haney Lopez. And what it goes into is the fact that during the 1980s, there were certain calls, shall we say, or codified language from specifically the Reagan administration, certain images that were put up that really influenced America's perception of the criminality of Black people. And what we see is that this led to several bills. There was actually one in the 80s, and there was the big one we know about, the Omnibus Crime Bill in the 90s. And what this led to was broken windows policing policies that targeted Black folks, let's say, for drug use. Let's talk about this culture thing, brother, because actually statistically, Black folks and white folks are equally as likely to use drugs and at the same frequency and sell them as well. It's where the police were placed and where they were arresting folks and picking them up from and incarcerating them that we actually saw the systemic racism. Of course, you don't have to say the N-word was systemic racism because it's not in the letter of the law, but in the interpretation of the law. That's where you find it. And in that soft interpretation space is where we find the statistics on the back end. The Truth in Sentencing Project will tell you a lot more about that.
All right, thank you. And now for our last question in this Q&A round. This is for you, Theo. Do you believe racism / white supremacy will cease to exist in the near future? You have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
I happen to have left my crystal ball in the car. I can't really tell y'all that. But what I can say is that patternistically speaking, it would take a lot for it to fall. What I know and I'm encouraged by is that a lot of white people are divesting all the time in systems of white supremacy and racism because of the work that people who practice critical race theory or diversity, equity, and inclusion are waking them to, right? So what I feel is that statistically, white people's numbers are dwindling. And I believe this new census data report will show that. But that doesn't mean that white supremacy will go away. The problem is that Black people can participate in white supremacy too if they do not uproot internalized racism, which is a devious form of racism that comes from centuries of abuse. If you have it, I don't judge you for it because we all got problems. But the fact is that white supremacy will fall when all people are collectively are inviting white folks back into the human family instead of being superior above it.
All right. And this question and final question is for you, Justin. Do you believe Black people have inferior culture or cultural traits when compared to white people? You have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Overall, let me just put it this way. When our culture is linked to Christianity, it is not inferior. Everything outside of that, I will definitely say it is indeed inferior by the outcome of what we're doing. When you look at the very history of everything that has happened to us, right? Our culture should have prevented the colonization of all these things that happened. Our culture should have prevented the colonization of Islam, pretty much them taking over Africa, them actually enslaving us for more than 800 years before the white man. Our culture should have stopped that if we had greater or superior culture, but it didn't. And we cannot just practice insanity, or in other words, just repeating something over and over, expecting some change to happen, and then saying, well, it's going to work, we're going to overcome, like the way we've not been overcoming for the last, almost 1,000 years. So I would say culturally, yes, and I'm not tied to culture. I believe that culture could improve, I believe that we are not our culture. We create culture. And also, I believe that, other cultures, their failure to uplift their people is the reason why they may not be supreme, or they may not have supreme culture in that way. But it's not in the DNA, it's in the culture.
Thank you to our audience for posing the questions, and to you gentlemen for participating in audience Q&A. Now we will go to our third and final round, closing statements. Each participant will provide an uninterrupted closing statement. We will hear the affirmative closing statement from Theo Wilson. You have 3 minutes.
When I think about Black culture, I think about the resilience that caused people to survive the most deadly, disruptive experiment ever run on human beings. When I think about Black culture, I think about King Bakongo Mvimba of the Congolese people, who had 1,000 slaves returned from Brazil to Africa. I think about all of the ways that, like, Muslims who were slave trading ended up losing to wars of West African empires, and how they set up their own stuff. When you talk about Black culture, you talk about resilience. That's also not being taught in our schools, but with diversity, equity, inclusion, mislabeled critical race theory, maybe it could. I speak at universities and I ask these kids all the time, what was happening in Africa in 1491? And none of them can answer me. But when we talk about the culture of Black folks, we might be able to discuss how the Renaissance was caused by the interaction with the Moors in the south of Italy and Spain. These are the things that are not talked about, right? If we taught a narrative of history that decentralized whiteness, we could see the fingerprint of Africans everywhere, all the written languages that we created. The fact that African people built the tallest building in human history, the Pyramid of Giza, until the Eiffel Tower. When we talk about all the inventions, so many things. The cell phone was invented by Black people, like things that we need in modern technology. These are the culture that creates in spite of the oppression. And when we don't relay that to white folks, right? When we don't teach what is mislabeled as critical race theory, then they get to keep on operating in ideas of their own supremacy, just because the only thing that was superior about them was the firepower. But just because I could beat up Stephen Hawking doesn't mean I'm smarter than Stephen Hawking, right? Just because I can beat up a woman doesn't mean I'm better than her. Firepower and force doesn't mean supremacy. And so we talk about a culture that has been able to use soft power against hard power to make our culture the most influential culture in the world. Right? Because you're only talking about hip hop, but what about jazz? What about blues? What about rock and roll, which we invented? Like, all of the things, like hip hop, all of the things that make America unique came from Black people. And if you don't understand that, then you really can't talk about critical race theory, because we're trying to dismantle systems that oppress people who create that. That's what we're trying to get white buy-in for. And that's what's so important, that we teach a decentralized narrative of history, a white decentralized narrative of history to all kids, so that they get at least round out what they know about Black folks and themselves. I'm gonna leave it there.
When it comes to critical race theory, like I said, it's definitely not helpful to anyone, because what it is just taking in the evils of white culture, which would be of racism and so on, that has cursed us. Take that and then try to hit them with it and see if it works and makes us better, or elevate it to them, or just in some way have them understand how we feel. So see, when it comes to critical race theory, all it does is create more division. It creates more, I would say, distrust among the races. And then we wonder why people are not understanding us, or why they're not, in harmony with each other. Basically, we're just acting like the racist and then saying, look, you taught us that. This is definitely not helpful. And then when it comes to culture and how Black people can elevate themselves, we elevate ourselves by objectivity, by rationality, by logic, by, I would say, God. These things, these truths, they should guide our feelings. We should not have our feelings and experiences guide truth and objectivity in those things. And I think that's what critical race theory does. It actually causes facts to follow feelings. And this is the problem with critical race theory, is that it tries to lead white racist or white people into becoming less racist by actually being racist based on their feelings of how they perceive white people. So, you know, they look at a white person and assume, oh my goodness, this person is thinking very negatively of me, or this person is actually pushing white supremacy on me in some way. All these things come from feelings, and our feelings, or at least the people who subscribe to critical race theory, their feelings paint their reality, and then it destroys all rationality. So that's where I'm just going to leave it at. That's why it's not helpful.
Thank you both, gentlemen. We appreciate you for participating in the Great Debate League tonight. Theo Wilson arguing the affirmative and Justin Wilson arguing the negative. As always, we have had a very critical discussion on an important issue, and we were able to learn from both of our debaters. Thank you to our sponsor for the evening, Natasha Ria Art Gallery. Audience, we ask that you please use our new scorecard to let us know how you scored each participant's performance. This is a quick form that should only take you about 2 minutes to complete. Please score each debater's performance in presenting fact-based arguments. So do they provide facts to support their statements? Subject matter expertise. Did they demonstrate an understanding to the subject matter of critical race theory? Persuasiveness. Were they logical and convincing arguments? Elocution. Were they clear and effective in their communication? And finally, rebuttals. Did they address their opponent's arguments effectively? Thank you to our audience for watching and participating. We ask for your continued support to keep this program running. You may donate to our Cash App so that we continue to grow. $, The Great Debate League. Also, please check us out on YouTube and subscribe. We also invite you to become a member of our Patreon page. We will have the post-debate analysis after this broadcast, which will start shortly. So we will provide a new broadcast link for you. Have a great night, everyone, and remember to speak the truth.